Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've brought us a really fascinating stack of articles and research notes today. We're digging into something pretty fundamental, aren't we? How communities of faith actually, well, look and work, especially when things get tough.
That's right. We're going deep into different models of church, trying to move beyond maybe the single picture most people have in their heads.
Yeah, explore the diversity that's out there based on your sources.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it isn't about saying this is the right way.
Right.
It's about unpacking three really distinct approaches to church planting that come up in the material.
Right. So our mission here is to kind of cut through the dense stuff, pull out the key insights, maybe spot some surprising facts.
Yeah, and clarify the distinctions, why these differences actually matter, especially in diverse places or challenging environments around the world.
It's the shortcut, basically. So you, the listener, don't have to wade through it all. You get the core ideas.
Okay, let's dive in then. The source material kicks off with the model that, well, most people probably picture first. It calls it the Prevalent Church model.
Ah, the familiar one. You think, okay, group of people, maybe they're part of a denomination. They gather. Often the big focus is a Sunday morning service, maybe other stuff during the week. And a key thing, the source notes, they usually own a building.
Yeah, that's a common feature. But the source is quick to point out, calling it prevalent doesn't automatically mean it's like the most biblical way or even the most common throughout history.
Just the most conventional, maybe, in many places today.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
And size-wise, this model can be pretty varied, right?
Oh, yeah, runs the gambit. Could be, say, 40 or 50 people, or it could be massive, like thousands.
And what's interesting you were saying is how the potential upsides, the advantages the source points to, they really shift depending on that size.
They really do.
Tell me more about that. How does size change the benefits here?
Well, the source notes that the smaller congregations, in this prevalent setup, they can foster really close relationships, higher personal involvement because, well, you actually know everyone.
Makes sense. Real community feel.
But then on the larger end, the benefits look different. The source mentions things like access to really high-caliber teaching talent,
Okay.
the ability to potentially impact a whole city, the resources to launch lots of different kinds of ministries, specialized programs for kids and youth.
Right, this stuff that needs more infrastructure.
And also, significantly, the capacity to put serious funding and people into overseas ministries.
The global reach aspect.
Yeah. And the source adds that larger churches can sometimes mobilize to tackle big social issues like alcoholism or poverty in their area.
That's interesting. It even says this can sometimes, gain favor with local officials. Maybe create space to operate even in less open countries.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. How the size can unlock different kinds of impact or influence.
So what about the leadership? How is that typically structured in this prevalent model?
The sources usually describe it as maybe a group of elders, often with a pastor as one of them. Or you might have a senior pastor leading a team of staff.
Okay.
Some might use a different kind of board, like trustees, not elders. And yeah, many, especially the larger ones, definitely have paid staff.
So the core spiritual life, the leadership, it tends to be quite centralized.
Yeah.
Focused on that main congregation and its structure.
Primarily, yes. Though it's important, the source does highlight that even medium and large churches in this model often really emphasize smaller home groups.
Right.
They see them as like the lifeblood, vital for the overall health and that deep fellowship, the koinonia.
Yeah, shared life, yeah. That makes sense.
Exactly. And their main growth strategy, it's usually just getting bigger as one main body.
Okay.
Though some do plant daughter churches, but those usually look a lot like the parent church. Same prevalent model.
Now, the sources also mention a common perception, maybe it's a bit of a stereotype, that this model can be kind of institutional, maybe denominational, a bit stuffy or formal.
Yeah, or focused inward on just comfortable programs instead of bold outreach.
Right.
But the source immediately calls that an unfortunate caricature.
Okay, good clarification.
Yeah, they stress that many churches operating like this are genuinely biblical, very healthy, especially when they really cultivate that strong community, that koinonia, and act as, quote, spiritual revolutionaries in their context, living faith out boldly.
That's a really key distinction. And for anyone thinking about planting a church, the source has a word of caution, doesn't it?
It does,
Yeah,
basically. Don't just dismiss this model because it's common or has stereotypes attached.
right.
It can actually be very suitable in places where there isn't active persecution. And the agency behind this research, they mention they've planted successful, healthy churches that follow this kind of prevalent model.
Okay, so that's the baseline, the common picture. What does the source offer up as the first main alternative model then?
That would be the cell church model.
Ah, okay. And the classic example the source gives is Yodo Full Gospel Church in Korea, Paul Yongki Cho.
That's the one. Legendary case study. Started incredibly small and became, well, the largest church in the world. It really shows the potential scale this model can reach.
Wow. So what's the core idea? How does it fundamentally differ?
The basic concept is pretty simple but really powerful. The entire church is structured around small groups called cells. Membership isn't just about showing up on Sunday. It actually requires you to be part of a cell group.
Okay, so the small group isn't just an optional program, it's the core structure.
Exactly. And these cells are active. They meet at least once a week.
And what happens in these cells? What's their purpose?
According to the source, it's twofold. First, really ministering deeply to each other within the group. Second, consistently reaching out, sharing Christ with friends, family, neighbors.
So nurture and outreach are built into the cell level.
Right. And the growth mechanism is inherent in the model itself. Cells are designed to grow, and then when they hit a certain size, maybe around 20 people, they subdivide or multiply. They birth new cells.
Like cellular division, hence the name.
Pretty much.
And the leadership within those cells.
It's focused. Each cell has a leader, and often they're actively raising up a leader in training within the group.
Okay.
And the source points out, these cell leaders, they aren't necessarily expected to be like mature Bible teachers or meet the qualifications of an elder. They can be spiritually younger, more focused on facilitating the group, caring for people, leading the outreach.
Interesting. So less emphasis on deep theological teaching from the cell leader, maybe?
Potentially, yes. But overseeing all these decentralized cells, there's usually a very elaborate, quite hierarchical leadership structure above them.
Ah, okay. So it's not just loose groups.
Not at all. You have layers. Cell leaders report to zone leaders who report to congregation leaders, all the way up to a central senior pastor. And a really key structural point from the source. This model often has no elders in the traditional sense. There's typically one main leader at the top holding significant authority.
Wow. Okay. That's quite different.
And that central authority is seen as crucial for keeping everything uniform and driving that multiplication across maybe hundreds or thousands of cells.
So you have all these small cells meeting, but do they ever come together?
Yes. Periodically, usually weekly or maybe monthly,
Yeah.
all the individual cells gather for a larger celebration service.
Got it. So if I'm understanding this, the spiritual life, the day-to-day activity, that's happening in a very decentralized way out in the cells.
Correct.
But the overall leadership, the vision, the direction, that's highly centralized.
Exactly. You nailed it.
And how do they maintain consistency across so many groups? Does the central leadership provide materials?
Often, yes. The source mentions that cell leaders are frequently given a specific program or a lesson outline from the central leadership each week to use in their meetings. Keeps everyone on the same page.
Makes sense for that kind of structure.
And the source emphasizes this model generally has a very strong focus on numerical growth, and measuring it often involves quite detailed reporting systems, tracking how cells are doing, flowing up that hierarchy.
Okay. What about where this model works best? You mentioned Korea was huge, but how does it fare in tougher places?
That's a really interesting point in the source. While it's been massively successful in places like Korea, the source explicitly notes it has not generally proved as successful in high persecution environments.
Why is that?
Well, it seems linked directly to that centralized leadership structure and those big, visible celebration gatherings. They become pretty easy targets for authorities who want to shut things down.
Ah, right. The very structure that gives it scale also creates vulnerability in a certain context.
Seems so. However, the source does give an example, a fruitful cell church among Muslim background believers, MBBs, in Central Asia. It grew to about 700 members across several people groups.
So it can work, even in challenging areas.
It shows it can adapt and be effective, yeah. Maybe not in the most hostile places, but certainly in challenging ones.
And is the model fixed, or can it be tweaked? The source mentions modifications.
Yeah, and notes the possibility of adapting it. For instance, incorporating elders alongside. Or maybe instead of relying solely on that single senior pastor structure. They've seen that happen in some cell churches in the U.S.
Okay. Interesting flexibility there.
Hmm.
So let's shift gears again. What's the second main alternative model your sources discuss?
That would be the house church model.
Okay, house church. This sounds perhaps smaller scale, driven by different priorities maybe.
Fundamentally, yes. The source connects this model to key figures in the West, like Dick Scoggins. His manuals, things like planting house churches and networks, are apparently highly valued by agencies working on the field. Many teams are deliberately trying to implement this approach.
And the most powerful recent example the source uses.
Mainland China, it's pretty staggering. They estimate maybe 90 million Christians in China. And the source states the vast majority are part of underground or semi-underground house churches.
Wow.
And these aren't just surviving under persecution. The source says they're thriving.
Thriving in persecution. That's a huge contrast to the more visible, government-approved three-self church there, which sounds like it operates more like that prevalent model we discussed first.
Exactly. It's a stark contrast.
So what are the defining features here? What makes a house church, according to the source?
Two words really stand out: smallness and, crucially, autonomy.
Autonomy, okay.
And their success in thriving under pressure, that's a big reason why some argue this model actually looks a lot like the most common form of church back in the New Testament times.
Ah, interesting historical connection.
Yeah, the source mentions those phrases like the church that is in their house and points out there weren't really purpose-built church buildings before Emperor Constantine.
Right.
So, given that resilience, it's often considered perhaps the best fit for the most hostile or resistant contexts.
But there's a challenge mentioned, isn't there, about getting new believers, especially from non-Christian backgrounds, to actually embrace this model. They might expect something more like the prevalent one they've seen or heard about.
Yes, the source definitely flags that. It can take real intentional effort to guide people toward understanding and adopting the house church concept.
And the practicalities are quite different, too.
Totally. No church buildings.
Yeah.
Generally no paid pastors. The source even quotes someone named Subama talking about work in India.
What did they say?
Something like, since we cannot expect Hindus to build large churches before they know the Lord, the house church, which they can patronize before baptism, seems a reasonable procedure. It's just more accessible.
Accessible, yeah. And presumably built for multiplication, like the cell model, but maybe differently. How does growth work here?
It's similar in encouraging evangelism within natural networks, friends, family, neighbors. And the groups grow, and then they reproduce or subdivide when they reach a certain size. Here, the source suggests typically around 12 to 15 adults, smaller than the cell subdivision point often.
Interesting. And what's the emphasis within the group?
The source really highlights participation. Every single person is expected to be involved. The group kind of covenants together to truly be the body of Christ for each other. They use the phrase, no wallflowers.
I like that. Everyone engaged. What about leadership in these small, autonomous groups?
Typically just one or two leaders per individual house church, but these leaders are expected to have a certain level of character maturity. They're seen as elders or at least candidates for eldership.
Okay, so maybe a higher bar for leadership maturity than the cell leaders we discussed.
That seems to be the implication, yes. More akin to the elder role.
Now wait, if each house church is small, autonomous, maybe only has one leader who functions as an elder, how does that square with the New Testament idea of a plurality of elders leading a church?
Good question. That's where the network becomes absolutely critical.
Okay, tell me about the network.
The source explains that the plurality of elders isn't usually found within one single house church. Instead, it's formed by the elders from across a whole network or cluster of connected house churches.
Ah, I see. So the collective leadership spans multiple groups.
Exactly. This informal networking and clustering is seen as vital for synergy, for sharing wisdom, for broader fellowship. And larger gatherings can happen within these networks, but only, if security allows it.
Right. Context is key again.
Yeah.
And does the source say anything about how new house churches start?
Yes, it puts a really high value on starting totally new house churches from scratch, often catalyzed around key individuals or existing relational networks, sometimes even involving people who are just seekers, not yet believers, but are genuinely exploring faith.
Starting from scratch, even with seekers, that sounds very organic.
Very, and this drive to start new, small, autonomous groups, coupled with that decentralized structure. That's precisely why the source calls the house model the most decentralized of the three.
And that decentralization is the key to its resilience in places like China or other tough environments.
That's the argument, yes. Its structure makes it much harder to disrupt on a large scale.
Okay, so let's try and pull these three models together. Your source material included a comparison, right?
Right.
To help clarify the distinctions.
It did, yeah. A table that really highlights the differences. If you look at leadership, for instance,
Yeah.
Prevalent, typically one board or leadership team over one congregation. Cell, that hierarchical structure under a single senior pastor usually. House, just one or two leaders or elders per house church, but the plurality of elders exists across the network.
Got it. And centrality, that was another big difference.
Huge difference.
Sure.
Prevalent. Largely centralized, even if home groups decentralize some activity. Cell. Decentralized spiritual life in the cells, but very centralized leadership. House. The most decentralized overall in both activity and leadership structure.
And growth strategy, how they multiply or expand.
Also distinct. Prevalent. Tends to focus on growing the main congregation larger, or maybe planting daughter churches that look similar. Cell relies entirely on those cells growing and subdividing. House. Churches reproduce by growing and dividing, and they actively start new groups from scratch, often around seekers or networks.
What about buildings? We touched on that, but it seems like a practical differentiator.
Definitely. Cell churches might rent larger spaces for those celebration gatherings. House churches, the source says, almost never own buildings.
And the advantage there is?
Frees up funds, obviously, but also avoids that institutional feel, perhaps. It's interesting, the source notes even some prevalent model churches, say in the U.S., are moving away from owning big buildings these days.
That is interesting. But of course, in really hostile places, owning a building might be impossible anyway, or just a huge liability.
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes that the house model's flexibility and resistance to persecution are key reasons it's so common in resistant populations. Buildings are often just not feasible or wise.
Makes sense. Now, the source did mention a specific challenge, particularly for pioneer house churches, right? Something about children.
Yes, ministering effectively to children. They're often in a vulnerable spot, facing pressure from non-believing family or at school. They really need grounding in the gospel, in scripture, equipping.
And that can be harder maybe in a very small, simple structure.
Potentially, yeah. Though the source rightly adds, meeting the needs of children is a vital task for any new church, regardless of the model. It's a universal challenge.
Good point. Okay, so summing up the core advantages the source highlights for each.
For the cell model, it's that potential to combine the intimacy of small group life with the synergy and clout of a larger structure. Things like access to specialized teachers, ability to run large-scale outreaches.
Right, the best of both worlds, potentially. And the house church.
Its core strengths are seen as deeper koinonia, that really intimate fellowship and shared life, and significantly better security and safety in those hostile contexts.
Okay. And the prevalent model, especially the larger ones, what's their unique contribution highlighted?
Historically, the source acknowledges larger prevalent churches have often had the biggest global impact in terms of mobilizing large-scale, coordinated efforts for sending missionaries and providing major funding for global evangelization.
Right, the capacity for large-scale organization and resourcing.
Exactly.
This all seems to lead towards the conclusion in your source material, which feels really grounded and realistic. It's basically impossible to just declare one model the best across the board.
Absolutely not. Every situation is unique. It really demands careful discernment, prayer, and crucially, waiting on the Holy Spirit's guidance for the specific context.
And the source includes a really powerful story, an anecdote from their own work in the Arab world that just drives this home, doesn't it? Shows the complexity.
It really does. It's quite a journey they recount.
Let's walk through that because I think it illustrates so many of these tensions and realities. How did it start there?
Well, the work began using what they describe as a kind of vague, sort of undefined house church model.
Why vague?
Partly out of necessity, it sounds like. They had a fairly small vision initially, maybe didn't expect it to grow beyond, say, a dozen adults, and they definitely needed secrecy.
Okay. But it did grow.
It did. It grew well beyond that initial small size. And then the government cracked down, persecution hit, authorities started bringing people in for questioning, threats, and the group scattered.
Wow. So the structure that was maybe chosen partly for resilience didn't entirely prevent scattering when the pressure really came on.
Not in that initial phase, no. Maybe the scale had outgrown the structure they had, or maybe other factors were at play. But then, as things started to rebuild, a couple of interesting things happened.
Where were they?
First, some of the believers actually started meeting in a registered building owned by a church from a Christian background. That offered some kind of legitimacy or cover, perhaps.
Okay.
And second, the main leader got specific training in the cell church model.
Ah, so did they then transition fully into being a cell church?
The source says no, they never fully implemented the whole cell model blueprint. But they did benefit from learning some of its organizational ideas.
Yeah.
And the group grew, again, in size and how it functioned. Eventually, they moved out of that burrowed building and effectively became more like a medium-sized congregation, meeting somewhat more openly, functioning, really, more like that prevalent type church we talked about first.
So they kind of cycled through different models or aspects of them.
Yeah.
And then what happened? Did that structure hold?
Sadly, no. It fractured again. But this time, the source emphasizes, the breakdown wasn't because of external police pressure. It was due to internal tensions, conflicts within the group itself.
Oof, that's tough.
Yeah. And as of when the source was written, they were apparently trying again to pursue a house church model, but describe the results so far as mixed.
Wow. That is an incredibly honest and frankly humbling story. Trying different things, facing external pressure, internal pressure. What were the main lessons the source pulled directly from that really difficult experience?
They listed 4 key takeaways, really practical. First, simply choosing the right model. And they tried variations of all 3. Remember, it doesn't guarantee success. Growth in that specific, challenging context remained limited no matter which structure they used.
Okay, so model choice isn't a silver bullet, lesson 1.
Exactly. Which leads right into lesson 2. Having the right strategy, whatever you decide that is never a guarantee of fruitfulness either.
Strategy isn't enough on its own. Got it. What's third?
Third, church planters, especially in these kinds of contexts, must be constantly seeking the Lord's specific guidance about which models, which strategies are actually best suited for that unique place at that specific time.
Continuous discernment and dependence. Makes sense. And the fourth lesson?
You have to stay open to experimentation, but be willing to try different approaches, maybe even things that seem counterintuitive. Over time, as the situation on the ground changes, be flexible.
Wow. Experimentation, flexibility, constant seeking. It really underlines that while understanding these models is super helpful,
It's essential. Yeah.
fruitfulness isn't just about picking the right blueprint off the shelf. It's about this dynamic, messy process of discernment and dependence on God's leading in the middle of real life.
Absolutely. That comes through so clearly.
So if we kind of synthesize all this, the real value you, the listener, get from this deep dive, it isn't walking away thinking, okay, Model X is the winner.
Definitely not.
It's more about understanding the distinct options laid out in these sources, knowing their strengths, their weaknesses, their typical applications, and recognizing that the crucial skill is really that wisdom and flexibility to figure out what might fit your specific context.
Yeah, considering the culture, the security risks, the potential for growth, the actual needs of the people.
And then being willing to adapt and keep listening.
That adaptability and ongoing reliance on guidance seems paramount. The context, whether it's hostile or open, the cultural norms, the realistic scale, it really dictates so much.
That makes so much sense. And it brings us back to that anecdote and those hard-learned lessons. If choosing the right model or even the right strategy isn't the ultimate key to fruitfulness, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Beyond all the human planning, the structures, the methods, what else might actually be the most crucial factor for seeing real growth and building lasting resilience in church planting, especially in the world's toughest places? Something for you to really chew on after this.
That's a vital question to sit with.
Well, thanks for bringing this material and walking us through it. It's been a fascinating deep dive into the diverse ways church can look and function. We really hope exploring these different models and hearing about those real-world challenges and lessons helps clarify the landscape for you as you think about communities of faith.